I walked towards this lady and I had my hand outstretched and I was going to shake hands with her. But as we got close, she stepped inside that handshake and she took me in an embrace. And she hugged me like a grandma hugs you. And you know that you're loved when a grandma hugs you. She put her head on my shoulder and she started to cry. I'd never met this lady before. She was an Australian and we were in Thailand. And what I learnt was that this lady had lost her daughter in the Boxing Day tsunami. Now we found her daughter, but she was dead. Now her daughter was on the holiday of a lifetime. You see, it was her honeymoon. So this lady that I was hugging, she lost her daughter and she also lost her son-in-law. We found him, but he was dead as well. And this couple had been together for a number of years before they got married, and 6 months prior to the wedding, they received some pretty special news. That was, they're going to be parents. Well, of course, the baby died as well. So this lady that I was hugging, she lost her daughter, she lost her son-in-law, she lost her future grandchild, and she lost any hope of any future grandchildren, because her daughter was an only child. Now, the hug that I was receiving from her, it should have been for her daughter, it should have been for her grandchildren, but it never would be. And this represents both the beauty and the tragedy of the work that I've done in this area. And this photo here also represents the beauty and the tragedy of Thailand, and those who recognise this would know it as Phi Phi Island. It's one of the beautiful locations in Thailand, and I landed on the beach in a helicopter, stepped out of the helicopter into the water, you see at the bottom of the photograph there, and looked at this and thought this is quite a stunning place, so I need to take some photographs because people aren't going to believe where I've been sent to work. But I walked 180 degrees around the other side of the helicopter, and this was the destruction on Phi Phi Island. And this is so typical of the places I've been to do the type of crisis work that I have. I could replace this with photos from Paddy's Bar or the Sari Club after the bombings, because the level of destruction that we saw there was just the same. I could replace it with photos from Japan after the tragic earthquake and tsunami, and the work that I did over in Japan last year represented many images similar to this. And I spent the last 2 years that I was working in New South Wales Police working on an international counter-terrorism project. And my brief for 12 months was to look at what we call CBRN, which is chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear threats. And I basically looked at what were the emerging threats and trends that were confronting the forensic science group, and I headed across to Lyon in Interpol and worked with them for some period. And then following that, I was invited to stay and I worked with the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime throughout Southeast Asia in a capacity building role around leadership and counter-terrorism. There was one recurring theme that kept coming up for me in this counter-terrorism space though, and that was hope is not a plan. We just can't hope that things won't happen. We just can't hope that we have the right leadership structures in place. But there is only so much contingency planning we can do, particularly when those challenges are so unique. And unique challenges certainly require unique solutions. And what we know following the Boxing Day tsunami is there were somewhere between 250 and 300,000 people who lost their lives. And we headed across to Thailand to identify those 5,395 bodies that we recovered. And this was the world's largest disaster victim identification attempt that would be undertaken. Thousands bigger than 9/11, therefore thousands bigger than anything that had been seen before. And the very scale of that presented a lot of unique challenges, because when they found the bodies floating in the water or washed up on the beach, they took them to a local temple. And temples in Thailand are called a wat, a W-A-T. And if you've been to a Buddhist temple, you'll understand when I say they have a very serene feel about them, a very sacred feel, regardless of whatever your faith is. And I arrived at this temple called Wat Yan Yao in the Phang Nga province of Thakurpa, and I walked into a temple, and a room probably twice the size of this. There was an open area, and all I could see covering the entire area was the decomposing bodies of 3,500 people. And as forensic practitioners, we have to do a post-mortem on each of these people. But where do you store the bodies of 3,500 people while you undertake this job? Because it was going to take us well over 12 months. And how do we meet these challenges? Well, it's certainly about building teams. And last year I was invited into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to work, and they had some floods in the city of Jeddah, and as a result of the floods 113 people died. And I was asked by the government to review the response and provide some training around crisis mitigation and around leadership. And what became clear to me in my response and my review of the work in Saudi was that people died unnecessarily, and they died because of the lack of trust and the lack of relationships. Because every one of you here today in the organisations that you represent, you'll have internal and external relationships. And if we maximise those relationships, we can achieve what might otherwise not be possible. But if we don't maximise the relationships based on fear or a lack of trust, we won't achieve things. And this is what happened in Saudi. You see, in the heads of the organisations who would be responsible for leading the response following the floods, there weren't good relationships and there wasn't any trust. And then in the days immediately following those floods, the heads of these organisations came together and were fighting for control. And it was very clear in my response, because of the lack of trust, because of the lack of relationships, people died unnecessarily. Now, I think there's two types of leadership that exist within our organisations. There's positional authority. So you look at the organisations in which you work and which you might own and run, and you can see who's at the top, and you can cascade all the way down and see where everyone sits. But does that mean in challenging times that might be brought about by some crisis or even unprecedented growth, that your key decisions and your key leaders are only going to come from those senior positions? Because in my experience, true leaders are identified by their actions and their reactions. It's leadership without authority, and it's what people do, not the positions that they hold, that really makes a difference. Now, when the Australians were invited across into Thailand following the Boxing Day tsunami, there was no conditions imposed by the Australian government upon the Thais. They didn't say, we'll happily send people over if these conditions are met. But once we arrived, the Australian leadership team held every key leadership position for about the first 6 months. Now, there was 36 countries represented, 400 international forensic staff from around the world, but the Australians held every key leadership position. What was that about? We didn't have any greater skill or experience or expertise or resources at hand. It was what the leadership team did that put us into those positions of leadership. And the first was that the Australian leadership team acted with speed. Because when there's an opportunity, when there's a gap within the marketplace or something new presents, so often the first to move will hold that position of leadership. If you wait until you've got all of the answers to all of the possible questions, someone will beat you to it. It was the fact the Australians acted decisively and moved first, put us into those positions, and it's why we held so many key leadership positions for that time. The second thing the Australians did well was to deal with change. And we all understand that as senior people, part of your responsibility is to drive change through your organisations and through the industry. And if we accept that change brings resistance, what do we do to address those issues of resistance before we seek to roll out the change program? So there's an author out of the States, and I love his work. His name's Seth Godin, and he says that he talks about change, and he says, if you are not upsetting people, you're not bringing about change. So if we accept we're going to upset people, what do we do to address the issues before we roll out those change programs? This was the second thing the Australians did well, was to lead with sensitivity. I'll give you an example of what that looks like for us. If you find yourself in somewhere like Bali or Thailand or Japan, and you're on holidays with your family, and you lose one of your family members to this disaster that's occurred, there is an overwhelming desire to find them, to have their body identified, and bring them home so you can bury them according to your faith. Following the Boxing Day tsunami, all of the bodies were taken to that temple at Wat Yen Yao. And there was a lady who had lost her 7-year-old daughter, and she was searching for the body of her daughter, and before the international police got control of the site, she would walk amongst those bodies. And at the end of the third day, she came across the body of a young girl on the ground. And she said to the local police, "This is the body of my daughter." They said to her, "Are you sure?" She said, "Without question." And they said, "Well, based upon that, that's a visual identification. You can take her." But guess what happened? It was a mistake. You make a mistake in this environment, and it's hard to come back from. And there's only one conversation I've had on a professional level, which is harder than sitting with a family, looking into their eyes and explaining to them that their 7-year-old daughter has died. The only thing more difficult is when you sit with that family, you say to them, "Yes, your daughter has died. We have recovered her body. But mistakenly, it's been taken by another family. They've now cremated her, and they've spread those ashes on a beach somewhere special to them." You don't come back from that. So to stop that happening, we had to impose our standards upon the Thais, our standards upon the Indonesians. We're stepping into a foreign country, and we're saying to the local police, local government officials and the local coroner, the way that you're doing your work, you can't do it anymore. You have to follow our policy and our procedures. A significant change program. But the reason it was implemented successfully, because the leaders led with sensitivity and dealt with those issues of resistance before we sought to roll out that change program. The third thing that we did well was to have in place a structure. You certainly can't turn up to a temple with 3,500 bodies and reinvent the process each day. You need a structure in place. And having spent 20-odd years in the cops are good at writing policy, good at writing standard operating procedures, but to the point where they overcomplicate things. And when we found a gap, we just wrote another policy or wrote another procedure. And we never spent time at looking at all the other procedure that had previously been written and saying, do we still need that? And we were doing things because that's the way it had always been done. But there's a need to reflect upon that. Because when you just overlay all of your teams with policy and procedure, you take away the creativity. You take away the ability or the opportunity for people to be true leaders, because all they're doing is following policy and procedure. And that leads into the fourth thing the Australians did well, was to lead with simplicity. Because as leaders, there's an expectation that you will make decisions without deliberation. If you consult, if you act with good integrity and good intent and you get it wrong, you'll be forgiven. But as leaders, if you fail to make decisions for fear of making the wrong decision, you won't be forgiven. And we had one of Australia's most senior police officers in Bali. He was so fearful of making the wrong decision, he failed to make any decision. We had to bring him back and replace him with someone else. Now, I could talk about those four things in some detail, but I certainly won't do that this morning. If I said to you there was one key thing the Australians did well in Thailand, and I saw reproduced by a man by the name of Mr. Sato in a small community in the Iwate prefecture of Japan, it's about presence. And I think this exists on three levels. It's leadership of the brand that you represent. It's leadership of the teams that you lead. And finally, it's leadership of yourself. And if we look at some recent events that have occurred, and that will make the point. And if we reflect on those tragic events out of Victoria after the bushfires in February of 2009, 173 people lost their lives. And Christine Nixon, who was a Chief Commissioner, was heavily criticised for her response. But Christine Nixon is a highly intelligent person. She is incredibly well educated. You don't become the first female police commissioner in Australia by chance. She's no one's fool, make no mistake about that. But that night she made a mistake, and she acknowledges that, and her mistake was that she left the command centre and went out for dinner. But if we're fair in our assessment of that, and what's the leadership point we draw from that, how many of those 173 people do we think would still be alive today if she'd remained out at the command centre instead of going out for dinner? I'd suggest to you none. Do we think that if she'd remained at the command centre she could have turned around the progress of the fire? Absolutely not. Why are we so critical of her, and why did she come under such harsh criticism? Because as a leader, she wasn't present. Because that's what's expected of our leaders, that you will be present. Because what it demonstrates to people is, one, you understand their challenges, and two, you care. Don't underestimate the value of being present with those teams that you lead. It's not sufficient to remain in your office with spreadsheets, with data and reports and have the information. Because if your teams don't see you throughout all of the organisation, if they don't see you, they don't think you care, and they don't think you know what's going on. And that's what one of the key things the Australians did well. Now, sitting next to that in equal importance for me is this concept of clarity of purpose, about understanding why we do what we do as an organisation, as a company, as a team, and as an individual. And I think it's incredibly important to be clear on what that is. Because we can have statements of values, and if there's congruence between what's written and people working to achieve them, that's good, but we've got to understand it. What's it about for me? Well, when I joined the police 25 years ago, the idea of spending a lot of time away from home working internationally was never on the cards. But after the work the Australians had done in Bali, we had cemented our role, that if something else happened in Southeast Asia, we'd be called upon to assist. And that's exactly what happened after the Boxing Day tsunami. I was on holidays on the south coast of New South Wales with my family. I got a phone call from work. They said, can you come home and head overseas? And I returned to work and headed overseas, and I spent a bit over a month over there, and I returned to Australia. And when I arrived home, I got off the plane, 6 o'clock in the morning. I was on my own. The team I'd been working with had come home a few days before me. I had to stay and do a handover to the new incoming team. I'm walking up the aero bridge, and as I get towards the top, I see there are 4 people who are standing there, and they're checking the passengers as they're coming off. And they're not normally there. And as I got closer, I started to get concerned. 3 of them were dressed in suits, and 1 of them was in customs uniform. Now, the reason I was concerned was 1 of them was a work colleague of mine. Well, I thought, well, clearly they're here to see me. And this can go one of 2 ways. It either means something cool's about to happen, or I'm about to be arrested for some prior deed I've committed. Now, thankfully, it was the former. You see, what had happened was Ken Moroney was the Police Commissioner of New South Wales at the time, and an absolutely outstanding man. He'd got up at 4:30 in the morning to come to the airport, have a cup of tea with me and say, Pete, I love your work. Now, and as a sign of his leadership, it wasn't something that was paraded before the media. He wasn't there to meet a large contingent. I travelled home alone. But as a leader of an organisation with 17,000 people, he saw the value of coming to the airport to meet me. So what these guys are standing at the top of the aero bridge for is 2 of them are going to take my hand luggage and my passport. They'll go down through customs and immigration. The other 2 will escort me this sneaky way all around the back to avoid all of that. So I'm on my way to the VIP room to see the boss, and I'm passing a duty-free store. Now, I stopped and I said to these guys, I said, do you think the Commissioner would mind if I stopped and bought some duty-free? And they said, no, I'm sure he's got nothing better to do with his time than wait for you to do your shopping. But as Australians, tell me if I'm wrong, when we travel overseas, we've got to buy duty-free, right? Not because we need it, but why? Because it's cheap. Let me tell you this quick story. I flew back in from Tokyo a few weeks ago. I arrived back in the Sydney at 6 o'clock in the morning. By 6:10, where am I? I'm standing in the duty-free store, and I'm looking and I'm thinking, well, what do I need? Well, I know I need nothing, but I've been overseas, so I've got to buy it, right? So standing next to me is this guy who's been on the same flight as me. And he's having a conversation with one of the ladies that works in the duty-free store. I'll describe her for you, and you'll know the type of person I'm talking about. She's the type of lady that works in somewhere like Myers or David Jones and sells perfume and lipstick and all that kind of stuff. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, she's looking far more beautiful and far happier than anyone should be. Now, she's asking this guy who's been on the same flight as me questions that men don't understand. Because what she's asking him to do, in some detail, is describe the scent of the perfume that his wife likes. I look at this poor guy, I can see the pain on his face. And he said to this lady, he said, look, you don't understand. He said, I've been overseas. I have to buy my wife a bottle of perfume. He said, what it smells like? It really doesn't matter. He said, the thing is, though, if I don't go home with something, I'm in strife. Anyway, confirms his theory. I go and have a cup of tea with the boss. He says, I love what you do, now go back to work. So I'm back at work for a few weeks, and then I get a phone call from the Australian Federal Police. Because they were the lead agency in this response, the states, we were just putting together the teams. We had the capacity. So this lady from the AFP called me and she said, Pete, would you go back over and would you do another tour? I said, absolutely. Now, in this one phone call, we sorted out all of the details. I knew what day I'd go, what flight I'd be on, where I'd stay, what my role would be, and basically how long I'd be gone for. Everything was sorted out in this one phone call. The last thing I said to her before I hung up was, go ahead and book the tickets. So, two things are going to happen after I hung up the phone. The first is I walked out of my office into my boss's office next door. I said to him, Mark, I'm heading overseas for another 4 or so weeks. He said to me, cool, enjoy yourself. The other thing is this lady will ring up and book the tickets. All done, all taken care of, nothing left to do. I went home and I said to my wife, I said, Nick, I've been asked to go back overseas. I said, but before I make any decisions, I said, I want to understand how you... There's two ladies at the front and they're not impressed. You've got that look on your face like, I don't think I like you anymore. Let me tell you, not Robinson Crusoe. Anyway, I went and did this next tour. I was back at work and they called again and said, would you head back over and do a third tour? I said, sure. And when I was going over, I was leading the Australian team, and on that last occasion, I was leading an international team. And the significance of that has never been lost on me. But that wasn't why I was going. I went home and I said to my kids, I said, I'm heading back overseas. And Jack's my youngest bloke, and he said to me, Dad, please don't go. He said, why do you go? We miss you when you're gone. So I thought about this and thought, I've got to be absolutely clear around why I do what I do. So I got my 3 kids and I sat them down and I had a chat. And I said, what happened on Boxing Day? I said, there was families just like us. Mum, Dad and the kids all on the beach, all having a fantastic time. It was 10 o'clock in the morning and it was a beautiful day. And the water went out. And what that did was draw all these people down to the water's edge. No one knew what was about to happen. 10 minutes after the water went out, it came back in. And when it came back in, it was a wall of water that in some places was 10 metres high. Now, of those families that were on the beach, there were some kids that survived, there were some mums and dads that survived, but there wasn't many families that survived intact that day. So think about those kids who find themselves now in a foreign country, they're alone, they've lost mum and dad. How frightened and how scared must they be? They'll stay in Thailand until someone helps them return to the country that they've come from. But they go home alone. Because if mum and dad have died, they're now frozen in a body bag in a shipping container. So where do these kids go when they've returned home? Where do they go to pay their respects to mum on her birthday and lay some flowers? Because until we identify her, she doesn't go home. Or where do they go on a special day like Father's Day to let some balloons go and have a chat to Dad? Until we identify them, they don't go home. Those of you here this morning who have young children in your life, be they your children, your grandchildren, or nieces and nephews, imagine this. You're on the beach with those children and you see that wall of water coming. What do? You grab your kids, you hang on to them with all the strength you've got, and you run faster than you've ever run before. That water catches up. It knocks you over. You fight with everything in you to save the lives of your children. But for some reason you survive and your children don't. You spend every minute you remain in Thailand searching for your children. You go to the hospitals, the victim centres, the villages and the mortuaries. You search for your kids. But there comes a point in time when you can no longer stay in Thailand. You have to return home. And you return home without that most precious thing in your life, your children. And when you get home, you hope every day someone's going to ring you and say, it's okay, we found them, they're alive, they're in a hospital somewhere. But common sense tells you that's not going to happen. Common sense tells you your children have died. How do you possibly start to move on until you know that for sure? So I said to my kids, I said, this is what I do. I head overseas and I help put in place a process that will identify the mums and dads and identify the kids so we can send them home. And when we have a hard day working in this industry, as we all inevitably do, we have to understand why we do what we do. And for me, it's represented by this little guy on the screen. His name's Alexander, and he's 15 months old. Now, as a dad, every day that little guy spends frozen in a body bag, in a shipping container. It's too long. I want to identify him, and I want to send him home. Now, I started this by saying as organisations, we have statements of values and vision statements, and we can say whatever we want. We can say we're the greenest, we're the cleanest, we're the safest. We value our clients, our staff, our passengers more than anyone. Everyone operates with honesty and integrity, don't they? It's written in those statement of values. But how true are you to those things? And what is fundamentally the most important thing to you as an organisation and as a work group? Because if you are clear, when your resolve is tested through whatever means, it's far easier to make those informed decisions if you're clear around why you do what you do. I've spoken a little bit about crisis and a bit about disaster, but it's not about that. It's about understanding that leadership matters. And leadership matters for absolutely every one of us. It doesn't matter where you sit within the organisation that you represent. If you want to make a difference, it's about deciding leadership matters. If you want to make a difference in the communities in which we live, the schools where our kids go, or if there's something about your life you want to change, you're going to have to do it yourself. And what's leadership about for me? Well, it's certainly about courage. It's about meeting adversity head on every day. And I want to show you a photograph of 32 people who I'd suggest are leaders by any definition. You see, I met these kids when I was working in Thailand, and each of them had lost their parents, their homes, and many of their brothers and sisters to the tsunami. And this was where they lived. What you see in the background is the tent. It's a good-looking tent, I grant you that, but it's still just a tent. I'm going to share some brief stories with you on this basis and this basis alone. We can't change what's happened, but we can all change what happens next. I couldn't change the fact that these kids had lost their homes and their families, but it felt within my capacity to do something to change the way they spent each night. So I set up an organisation called Hands Across the Water. I was still working full-time in the cops. I thought, I got no idea how I'm going to do it, but I wanted to see if I could raise some money and change the way these kids spent each night. 12 months after making the commitment, I was able to head back over to Thailand and open this home that we'd built for the kids. It's called Ban Tham Nam Chai, and it is a beautiful home. And the reason why I was able to raise enough money to build it was because we decided to focus on the results and not the excuses. And as senior people who drive change through your organisations, you know that often you'll put a new idea, you'll put a new change program on the table, and people will find reason not to support it. They'll show you what's wrong with it, where the holes are, why it's someone else's responsibility. It's safe to do nothing. If you do nothing, nothing changes. So we built the home and all of the kids moved in, but very quickly the numbers doubled. They went from 32 to 64, and why that happened was because there was too many organisations that didn't commit long term. After a crisis situation, it doesn't matter where I've worked, whether it be Indonesia, Thailand, Japan, Saudi, or here in Australia. Lots of people turn up in the short time afterwards. They put their flag in the ground and say, we're here to help. But too many leave too quickly. Because what message does it send to the community when they pack up their tents and leave? It says you're on your own. You want to bring about long-term change, you need to make long-term commitments. So I built them another home, and this one's located right next door to the first one. You can see the first one in the back right-hand corner there. Moved all the girls into this one in January of 2009, and they all had their own bed again. They didn't have to share. They didn't have to sleep on the floor. And this is what it looks like inside. It is a beautiful home. It's filled with colour, with light, and thanks to the gorgeous staff we have, it's filled with love. And there's a standing invitation from me here to you today. If you find yourself in Thailand and you'd like to spend an hour or a day with these kids, you're more than welcome. Now, the Chinese have a proverb that says, if you want to plan for a year, sow rice. If you want to plan for a decade, plant trees. You want to plan for a lifetime, you need to educate people. So I built this centre and opened it in January of last year. It cost us 1.4 million Australian dollars to build, and it's at a place called Ban Nam Kam, the worst affected area all in Thailand. Still has 50% unemployment. And I thought if I'm serious about assisting this community, we need to address that. So we built this, and we're addressing those issues, providing training and healthcare and all the rest. And it provides a unique service. You see, the roof is built at a height of 17.5 metres above ground level, and it's engineered to hold 1,000 people standing on it at any one time. What is it? It's a tsunami refuge area. Now, those of you who have little boys in your life, you'll understand when I say that little boys love to run fast. Little boys love to run real fast, and it doesn't matter how appropriate the location is. Well, this little superhero here was in the race of his life. And to be more accurate, it was the race for his life. He held the hand of his grandfather, and they ran from that wall of water that was the tsunami. And run as fast as they could, there was a significant challenge for them. 50 metres in front was a building. If they could get to that building, that gave them their best chance of survival. Run as fast as they could, though, they were never going to be able to outrun this wall of water. They got to a tree, and Grandad climbed the tree, and he dragged this little superhero up to the top of the tree with him. They got to the top, they were both cut, they were bleeding, they had abrasions all over them, but they had survived. But there was no wild celebrations at the top of the tree. You see, when they were running, Grandad had this little guy in his right hand, and in his left hand, he had his younger brother. Now, when he got to the base of the tree, he knew that if he didn't survive, none of them would. He also knew he couldn't climb the tree hanging on to both of his grandchildren. He had a decision to make. Which one of his kids would he take up the tree, and which one would he let go of? How do you make a decision around who lives and who dies? He let go of this little guy's brother. He was washed away, and he did die. And every day since, Grandad, he asks himself the same series of 3 questions. And each time I go back to Thailand, I see him, and he's an old man now, so much older than his years would tell you. The 3 questions he asks himself are, could I have run faster that day? Could I have been stronger? Could I have made a different decision? The thing is, he had the courage to make a hard decision, and that's certainly what leadership's about. And every one of you here this morning, you'll be faced with hard decisions, be that in your business life or your private life. And some of them will lay awake for the nights on end thinking, is what I'm about to do the right thing? You'll make that decision. You'll spend another number of countless nights awake thinking, is what I've done the right thing? I think you should take comfort in the fact that you had the courage to make a hard decision, because that's certainly what leadership's about. In 2009, I took some people, some I knew and some I didn't, but we all very quickly became friends, and we went on this bike ride from Bangkok down to Khao Lak, a distance of 800 kilometres over 8 days. It's an amazing experience to ride down the east coast, cross over the mountains, down the west coast into the mountains. And we raised $178,000 before I went away, and I thought we should do that again. 2010, we had 34 people, equally as good experience. And the numbers grew, and I thought, I'm onto something here. So in 2011, I did it twice. I rode 800 Ks down with one group, dropped them off, flew back to Bangkok, and rode down another 800 with another group. We raised well over $500,000. And this year, we rode from a place called Nong Khai. We do it in January each year. From Nong Khai down the Mekong River into an orphanage at Yosaton, outside of Ubon Ratchathani. Dropped that group off, picked up another group. You can see a bit of a pattern, can't you? What makes these bike rides special? Well, it's the people. We had this beautiful lady who joined us this year. Her name is May Thil. May Thil is a 54-year-old Thai lady, and she set up an orphanage 23 years ago to support kids who have HIV or who had lost their parents to HIV. And she wanted to ride to set an example to the kids. She wanted to say to them, just because you face significant challenges, just because the cards that have been dealt to you don't look fair, don't give up. Pursue your dreams. Now, what does she know about personal challenges? Well, 9 years ago, she was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer, and she was given 6 months to live. Each day she rode, though, she'd ride into the hotel, and as we got off our bike, none of us there complained that what we'd done was too hard, we'd ridden too far, or it was too hot. Being in her presence was inspirational. And I think there's 3 areas in which we look after ourselves. One's around professional development, and that's part of what this conference is about. The second is how you look after yourself and your teams through a welfare perspective. But I think the third element that drops away, particularly when you're busy, as many of you are, is how often do you take time to feed your soul. For me, riding 1,600 kilometres through Thailand each year with people like this is food for my soul. And my question to you was, when was the last time you did something to feed your soul? Be it if you want to learn to sing, if you want to take a trekking holiday through Nepal with your mates, or head to Paris with the person that means most to you, now's the time to do it. Don't wait until the time's right, because that time might not come. If not now, then when? If not you, then who? And the reason why the bike ride is successful, the reason why the charity they run is successful, and they both are, is because we offer experiences. If you want to bring about change, if you want to improve the leadership of your team, or create an emerging leaders program within your organisation, find a way to give people experiences. Because when you give experiences, you get engagement. And that's what works for us. Now, I get asked to take on lots of different projects around the world. Been asked to go into Sri Lanka, Cambodia, India, Pakistan. We can't say yes to all. And as business people, you understand that growth has to be right. It has to be measured. In 2010, I received a phone call about this orphanage at Yosaton called Home Hug, where the kids were living with HIV. I heard enough, I thought I should go. I travelled up and I saw these kids who were sick. They were dirty. Many of them smelt. And where they lived, well, it was sad. These children were loved on a level I haven't seen before, and the dedication from Kunthil is something I haven't seen before. But the children were continuing to die. And that shouldn't happen. HIV isn't a virus that used to exist. It still exists today. It's a leading cause of death in Thailand, and the incidence of infection is on the rise here in Australia. But if you get it here in Australia, you live for another 50 or 60 years. Why were they dying in Thailand? And the message I took from visiting up there was you can't continue to do the same thing and expect a different result. What Kunthil was doing was amazing, but the children were dying on a monthly and weekly basis. We had to do something different. Our work continues, and 2 weeks ago I returned from Thailand, and in 2 weeks I'll be back there, and we're working to give some kids who live in the hill tribes outside of Chiang Mai a new opportunity, because these kids are born into the most maligned community in all of Thailand, and by the age of 8, 9 and 10 the girls are pretty much out of school. They're working in the coffee and tea plantations, and they do that until they're old enough, and then they're trafficked into the brothels. And that's where they'll work, and by the age of 15, 16 they'll have children of their own. And that cycle will just repeat unless there's some type of change. And I'm heading back up there in another couple of weeks to select a group of kids who will move into a new home that I've just built ahead of another one that I want to start at the end of the year. But here's a question for me, and I don't know the answer. How do I look into a community of 60 girls and select 20 that will change their lives for them? How do we say no to the others? How do I leave that 40 behind? I don't know what to do. But what I do know is that with action comes clarity. With action comes momentum, and with action comes results. So I'll continue to take action. We'll continue to bring about results. I just want to leave you with some photos before I finish up this morning of those kids in Thailand, and you'll understand why it was easy for me to say yes and do the work I do.